The vast, shimmering expanse of the Ionian Sea has long been the cradle of myths, a place where gods once played with the fates of men, and where the line between unimaginable wealth and absolute ruin has always been perilously thin. In the mid-20th century, this ancient backdrop served as the stage for a modern Greek tragedy so profound that it seemed to echo the cautionary tales of Sophocles or Euripides. At the center of this storm stood Aristotle Onassis, a man who rose from the ashes of the burning city of Smyrna to become the wealthiest individual on the planet, a titan of industry who redefined the meaning of global influence. Yet, beneath the veneer of sun-drenched private islands, golden faucets, and alliances with the world's most iconic women, there lay a darkness that no amount of money could illuminate. The story of the Onassis Dynasty is not merely a chronicle of financial conquest, it is a haunting exploration of the Onassis curse, a series of cascading personal catastrophes that suggests a heavy price must be paid for reaching toward the sun. To understand the fall of this house, one must first look at the relentless ambition of its patriarch, a man who viewed the world as a chessboard and everyone in it, including his own family, as pieces to be moved in pursuit of an ever-shifting horizon of power. Aristotle's journey began in 1922, amidst the horrific Great Fire of Smyrna, an event that stripped his family of their fortune and instilled in him a permanent, visceral hunger for security. Fleeing to Argentina with nothing but a few $100s sewn into his clothes, he began a meteoric ascent in the tobacco trade before realizing that the true veins of global wealth ran through the ocean. By the 1950s, Onassis had pioneered the use of supertankers, massive steel leviathans that carried the lifeblood of the industrial world, oil, across every meridian. His fleet was a sovereign nation unto itself, flying flags of convenience and answering to no one but the man known simply as Ari. He lived a life of nomadic luxury aboard the Christina O, a converted Canadian frigate that was less a yacht and more a floating palace of excess, adorned with Renoirs and bar stools upholstered in the skin of whale testicles. On this vessel, he entertained kings, prime ministers, and Hollywood royalty, weaving a web of influence that made him a shadow player in international geopolitics. However, this obsessive accumulation of status and gold created a vacuum where a stable family life should have been, setting the stage for a generational conflict that would eventually tear his world apart from the inside out. The cracks in the foundation of the Onassis Empire first became visible through Aristotle's marriage to Athena Tina Lavanos, the daughter of his greatest shipping rival. This union was less a romance and more a strategic merger of two powerful Greek dynasties, intended to solidify a monopoly over the seas. Together they had two children, Alexander and Christina, who were born into a world of incomparable privilege but were starved of the emotional consistency required to survive it. Alexander, the heir apparent, grew up in the towering shadow of a father who was both a hero and a tyrant, a man who demanded perfection and viewed any sign of weakness as a betrayal of the family name. Christina, on the other hand, became a perpetual seeker of affection, her life defined by a desperate need for the approval of a father who was often more interested in his public image than the private well-being of his daughter. As Aristotle's public life became a spectacle, marked by his high-profile affair with the opera diva Maria Callas and his eventual, controversial marriage to the widowed First Lady of the United States, Jacqueline Kennedy, the internal dynamics of the family soured into a toxic mixture of resentment and isolation. The year 1968 marked a pivotal turning point, as the marriage to Jackie Kennedy, intended to be Aristotle's ultimate trophy, instead became a catalyst for domestic discord. The Greek public viewed the union with suspicion, and Aristotle's children saw Jackie as a cold interloper who was draining the family's coffers and heart. Alexander, in particular, felt his father's marriage was an insult to the memory of his mother and a sign that Aristotle had lost his way in the pursuit of superficial prestige. This tension created a fractured household where communication was replaced by expensive gifts and cold silences. Aristotle, blinded by his own ego and the belief that he could control destiny as easily as he controlled his shipping lanes, failed to see that his children were drifting into dangerous waters. He was building a monument to himself, unaware that the weight of his legacy was becoming an unbearable burden for those who were meant to inherit it. The stage was now set for the first of the great tragedies, an event that would shatter the patriarch's spirit and begin the rapid unraveling of the House of Onassis, proving that even the master of the seas could not command the winds of fate. The true deluge of misfortune began to descend upon the Onassis Empire on a fateful January afternoon in 1973, an event that permanently altered the family's trajectory and marked the beginning of the most haunting chapter of their history. Alexander Onassis, the only son and the primary vessel of Ari's hopes for a lasting shipping legacy, was a passionate and somewhat reckless aviator at the age of 24. On January 22, his Piaggio P.136 aircraft plummeted into the waters near the Ellinikon International Airport in Athens shortly after takeoff. This catastrophic crash was more than a personal loss. It was a lethal strike to the very heart of Aristotle's world. Standing by his son's hospital bed, watching Alexander's life maintained by the rhythmic wheezing of a ventilator while irreversible brain damage rendered his future impossible, the most powerful man in the world felt the chilling touch of absolute helplessness. Aristotle summoned the preeminent surgeons from across the globe, offering his entire fortune for a single shred of hope, but the fates had already made their decision. When the machines were finally silenced at the family's request, Aristotle Onassis collapsed. It was observed by those closest to him that the patriarch's soul seemed to exit the room alongside his son's final breath. The aftermath of Alexander's death triggered a profound psychological deterioration in Aristotle, manifesting as a deep-seated paranoia that his son had been assassinated by business or political rivals. He offered multi-million-dollar rewards for proof of sabotage, despite official investigations concluding that the crash was the result of a technical error involving the cross-wiring of the plane's control cables. This grief acted as a corrosive acid on the already fragile foundation of his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy. While Jackie attempted to maintain her social standing and private life in New York, Aristotle retreated into the solitude of his private island, Scorpios. He spent countless hours sitting by his son's grave, drinking heavily and conversing with the silence of the Ionian Sea. The emotional chasm between him and the former First Lady became a public spectacle, as Aristotle began to view Jackie not as a partner, but as a jinx, a carrier of the Kennedy curse, who had infected his own house with tragedy. In his despair, he sought the familiar comfort of his former lover, Maria Callas, searching for the only person who truly understood the primitive, Hellenic depth of his sorrow. While Aristotle drowned in his own darkness, his daughter, Christina, was enduring her own psychological collapse. The loss of her brother, who had been her only true ally in a house filled with tension, sent her into a spiraling vortex of depression and chronic insecurity. Christina felt increasingly isolated in a world of gilded hollows, where affection was often a transaction. Her mother, Tina Lavanos, who had by then married Aristotle's arch-rival Stavros Niarchos, died under mysterious circumstances involving a drug overdose in 1974. The relentless succession of deaths within a span of 24 months left Christina emotionally shattered. She began to seek solace through a series of impulsive, volatile marriages and a dependency on prescription medication, her life becoming a frantic search for an anchor in a sea of inherited misery. Her struggle was not merely personal, it was a reflection of a dynasty rotting from the inside out, unable to sustain the weight of its own immense wealth. Ultimately, Aristotle's physical health began to fail as rapidly as his spirit. He was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a debilitating autoimmune disorder that caused his muscles to waste away, eventually forcing him to tape his eyelids open just to see. The sight of the man who once commanded global markets now trembling in a wheelchair, frail and gaunt, served as a grim testament to the limits of human power. His final days at the American Hospital of Paris were defined by a profound and bitter loneliness. Reports suggested that Jackie was frequently absent, focusing on the legalities of her future inheritance rather than the comfort of her dying husband. Aristotle Onassis passed away on March 15, 1975, leaving behind a colossal financial empire but no male heir to carry his name. His death did not break the curse. Instead, it transferred the entire, crushing burden of the Onassis legacy to the fragile shoulders of Christina, who now stood as the wealthiest, and perhaps the loneliest, woman on earth. With the passing of Aristotle Onassis, the crown of his maritime empire, a sprawling labyrinth of holding companies, real estate, and the world's most formidable private fleet, descended upon Christina. At only 24 years old, she became the sole custodian of a fortune estimated at over $1 billion, yet she inherited a throne built on shifting sands and stained by familial grief. Christina was a woman of immense intelligence and business acumen, often surprising the hardened board members of the Olympic Maritime Corporation with her sharp instincts and decisive command. However, the boardroom was the only place she felt a semblance of control. Outside of those mahogany-paneled walls, her life was a frantic, agonizing search for the one thing her billions could not procure: a stable, unconditional love. She famously remarked that she was a poor little rich girl, a cliché that in her case was a literal and devastating reality. Her existence became a cycle of extreme highs and lows, oscillating between the frantic energy of jet-set parties in St. Moritz and the paralyzing depths of clinical depression that kept her confined to darkened rooms for weeks at a time. The Onassis curse seemed to manifest most cruelly in Kristina's romantic life, which played out like a series of increasingly desperate gambles. Her third marriage to Sergei Kauzov, a Soviet shipping agent, sent shockwaves through the Western intelligence community during the height of the Cold War. For a brief period, the world's most famous capitalist heiress lived in a modest Moscow apartment, attempting to play the role of a common housewife in a socialist state. But the artifice of normalcy could not hold. The cultural chasm and the suffocating surveillance of the KGB eventually drove her back to the West. Each failed union further eroded her self-esteem, leading her to seek comfort in a dangerous cocktail of barbiturates to sleep and amphetamines to stay awake. She battled her weight with the same intensity she applied to business, fluctuating wildly as she used food to fill the emotional void left by her father's absence and her mother's tragic end. Her wealth made her a target for opportunists, leaving her perpetually paranoid about whether she was being pursued for her soul or her bank account. In the mid-1980s, Kristina believed she had finally found her savior in Thierry Roussel, a charming French pharmaceutical heir. Their marriage was the ultimate attempt to create the traditional family she had always craved. In 1985, she gave birth to a daughter, Athena, named after her mother. For a brief moment, it appeared the dark clouds over the Onassis dynasty had finally parted. Kristina was a devoted, perhaps overprotective mother, determined to shield Athena from the traumas that had defined her own childhood. She spent millions on nurseries and toys, creating a gilded cocoon for the infant. Yet, even this joy was poisoned. It soon came to light that Roussel was maintaining a long-term affair with a Swedish model, Gabi Landhage, with whom he was fathering children simultaneously during his marriage to Kristina. The betrayal was absolute. Kristina found herself in the humiliating position of funding her husband's secret life and his other family, a realization that shattered what remained of her mental fortitude. The final chapter of Kristina's life was a tragic race against her own shadow. Distraught by the collapse of her marriage and the persistent feeling that she was a failure in the eyes of her late father, she retreated to Argentina, the land where Aristotle had first built his fortune. In November 1988, at a private country club in Buenos Aires, Kristina was found dead in her bathtub. The official cause was a pulmonary edema, but the underlying narrative was one of a heart that had simply given out under the strain of immense sorrow and chemical dependency. She was only 37 years old. Her body was flown back to Greece to be buried on the island of Scorpios, laid to rest alongside her brother and father in the family's white marble mausoleum. The world watched in stunned silence as the Onassis line narrowed down to a single, 3-year-old child, Athena. The empire was now in the hands of a toddler, and the saga of the world's richest family had reached a point of near total extinction, leaving behind a legacy that served as a haunting memento mori for the age of excess. The death of Kristina Onassis left the world's most burdened inheritance in the hands of a 3-year-old girl, Athena, who became the sole legal heir to a fortune that had claimed the lives of everyone who touched it. The transition of power from the volatile, emotional world of Kristina to the cold, clinical administration of the Greybeards, the board of advisors appointed to manage the Onassis Foundation, marked a new era of legal warfare. Athena was raised in Switzerland by her father, Thierry Roussel, and his partner, Gabi Landhage, far removed from the sun-drenched shores of Greece and the whispers of her family's ghosts. However, the shadow of Aristotle Onassis was not easily escaped. For much of her childhood, Athena was the subject of a bitter tug-of-war between her father, who sought greater control over her trust funds, and the Greek trustees, who viewed Roussel as a mercenary intent on draining the Onassis legacy. This environment of litigation and suspicion ensured that Athena grew up viewing her wealth not as a gift, but as a source of perpetual conflict and a barrier to a normal life. As Athena approached her 18th birthday, the world watched with bated breath to see if she would take up the mantle of the Olympic maritime empire and return to Greece to claim her place as the Queen of the Ionian. But Athena was a different breed of Onassis. Unlike her grandfather, who craved the spotlight, or her mother, who was desperate for acceptance, Athena displayed a stoic, almost detached demeanor toward her heritage. She famously declared that she wanted to forget the Onassis name and everything it represented. Her passion lay not in the boardroom or on the decks of supertankers, but in the equestrian world. In the stables and jumping arenas, the noise of the tabloids and the weight of the family curse seemed to fade. However, the pattern of history began to repeat itself with haunting precision when she met and married the Brazilian Olympic showjumper Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known as Dota. Once again, an Onassis woman had sought refuge in the arms of a man who many believed was attracted as much to the magnitude of the fortune as to the woman herself. The management of the Onassis estate during this period became a masterclass in institutional preservation versus personal liquidation. While the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, established in memory of Aristotle's son, flourished as one of the most prestigious philanthropic organizations in the world, the private wealth of Athena began to dwindle, not through poor investment, but through a systematic dismantling of the past. Athena began to sell off the physical reminders of her family's glory. The legendary Onassis apartment on Avenue Foch in Paris was sold. The jewelry that Christina had worn as armor in her social battles was auctioned at Christie's, and most shockingly, the private island of Scorpios, the sacred ground where her mother, uncle, and grandfather were buried, was leased to a Russian billionaire. To the Greek people, this was more than a real estate transaction. It was the final severance of the Onassis bloodline from the land that had made them legends. Athena's actions suggested a woman who was trying to buy her way out of a haunted house by selling the furniture piece by piece. The ultimate irony of the Onassis dynasty lies in the divergent paths of the name and the blood. The foundation, led by the Greybeards, continued to build hospitals, award scholarships, and fund cultural centers, ensuring that the name Aristotle Onassis remained synonymous with Greek pride and global excellence. Yet, the actual descendants of Aristotle were retreating into obscurity, driven by a desire to be ordinary in a way their ancestors never could. By the time Athena's marriage to Dota ended in a bitter, highly publicized divorce in 2016, amidst allegations of infidelity that mirrored her father's betrayal of her mother, the Onassis curse seemed to have completed its work. It had transformed a family of titans into a cautionary tale about the toxicity of extreme wealth. The empire had been built on oil and steel, but it had been held together by the fragile threads of human ego, and once those threads snapped, there was nothing left but the cold, impersonal machinery of a charitable trust and a young woman determined to be the last of her kind. The final act of the Onassis saga is not one of a sudden, fiery explosion, but a quiet, chilling evaporation of a legacy that once bestrode the world like a colossus. Today, the name Onassis exists in a strange, bifurcated reality. It is a gold standard of global philanthropy on one hand, and a hollowed-out memory of personal tragedy on the other. Athena Onassis, the final blood descendant of Aristotle, has effectively become a ghost within her own history. Living a life of extreme privacy, she has distanced herself from the Greek identity that her grandfather wore as a badge of honor. By selling the majority of her Greek assets and opting for a life centered around the equestrian circuits of Europe and Brazil, she has performed a slow, methodical erasure of the Onassis brand from her personal identity. This is perhaps the ultimate defense mechanism against the curse, a recognition that the only way to survive the weight of such a name is to stop carrying it altogether. The tragedy of the third generation is not the loss of money, for she remains immensely wealthy, but the loss of belonging. She is a woman with $1 billion inheritance and no true home. Reflecting on the ascent and fall of this dynasty reveals a profound lesson about the nature of power in the modern age. Aristotle Onassis believed he could outmaneuver fate by building walls of gold and steel, yet he inadvertently created a gilded prison for his descendants. The very traits that made him a titan, his ruthlessness, his obsessive need for control, and his view of relationships as strategic acquisitions, poisoned the emotional well from which his children and grandchildren had to drink. The Onassis curse was likely not a supernatural phenomenon, but a psychological one, a toxic inheritance of trauma, unrealistic expectations, and a profound inability to find intimacy in a world where everything has a price. The family's story serves as a stark reminder that while wealth can buy the silence of the seas and the service of kings, it is powerless against the internal decay of the human spirit. The House of Onassis did not fall to a rival business empire or a political revolution. It withered from within, starved of the simple, unvarnished affection that its patriarch traded away for global dominance. As the sun sets over the Ionian Sea, hitting the white marble of the tombs on Scorpios, the silence is deafening. The island, once the site of the world's most decadent parties and the center of global media attention, is now a private enclave for a new generation of the global elite who have no connection to the man who built it. The supertankers still roam the oceans, and the Olympic maritime flag still flies, but the heartbeat of the family is gone. Aristotle's dream of a 1,000-year dynasty died with Alexander in the wreckage of a small plane, and the fragments were scattered by the winds of Christina's despair and Athena's indifference. What remains is a cautionary tale of the 20th century, a story of a man who conquered the world only to find that he had lost his soul, and a family that possessed everything the heart could desire, yet lacked the one thing that makes life worth living. Ultimately, the dark tale of the Onassis dynasty concludes with a haunting irony. The world remembers Aristotle Onassis for his billions, his yachts, and his famous wives, but his true legacy is the void he left behind. The story of the richest man in the world is, in the end, a story of profound poverty, an emotional bankruptcy that no amount of Greek oil or shipping lanes could ever rectify. As the last of the Onassis line moves further into the shadows of anonymity, the world is left to contemplate the ruins of their empire, a monument to the fact that the most expensive things in life are often those that cannot be bought, and that the greatest tragedy is not losing one's fortune, but losing the family for whom that fortune was built. The curtain falls on the House of Onassis, leaving behind only the cold, rhythmic sound of the waves against the shore of an empty island.